Hey everyone, welcome to episode 17 of the Current Review podcast. Today we have on a really interesting guest. His name is Wade Higgins. He is currently the manager of retail charging at Walmart, and he has previously worked at many different EV companies, including Tesla and Rivian. Wade owns several really cool electric cars, including an original Tesla Roadster and a Rivian R1S. So without further ado, I think we can just start talking about your history in the EV space. So when did you officially start working in the EV area?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Andrew. I would have started working with EVs July of 2012. He started my career basically in a part-time role for Tesla while I was still in college. It was a nice confluence of luck in the sense that I was looking for a summer job between my junior and senior years. I have always been, a little bit of an environmentalist, and I've always been a car nerd as well. And, I knew about Tesla, and they happened to have been opening a store in Portland, Oregon at the time. I want to say it was like the 24th store globally or something like that. And, they were hiring for some full-time roles and some part-time roles, and the part-time role kind of synced up exactly with what I was looking for. So I think it was about 30 hours a week for pretty much my entire senior year. And then I went full time with them the moment classes ended. And then I transferred to an actual dedicated full-time role with them a few months later, which transferred me from Oregon down to Palo Alto. And, largely been working with them ever since.
Exciting. And then, so when did you buy the Tesla Roadster?
So I bought the Roadster used, funny enough, not from Tesla themselves, while I was still working at Tesla. Just to give you a little bit of context of what the EV world looked like in 2012, 2013, 2014. There were very few EVs available at the time, and there were very, very few compelling EVs. Basically back then, if you wanted to drive something electric, it was either you spent a ton of money on a Tesla, or you spent less money on something like a Volt or a Leaf.
Or the iMeef.
Yeah, the Mitsubishi was there. I was going to say, there were a few other, for lack of a better term, compliance cars out there. But even then, I lived in California, so I had access to all of them. But if you didn't live in California, you couldn't. I'm sure you guys remember not only the iMyEV, but the original Fiat 500e that Sergio Marchionne literally told people not to buy because he lost so much money on each unit. But that was pretty much a California, Oregon only car, and it was probably leased 95% of the time anyways. So anyways, around that time, there weren't very many EVs available. And my sort of thinking at the time was that, I wasn't making a ton of money in salary, but I definitely had some Tesla stock. And in 2014, it had grown quite a lot since 2012. And so, especially for a 23-year-old, I had what I thought was a pretty good nest egg. But I thought all of my future net worth is kind of tied up in the equity markets. And so I thought I'd like to get myself an asset because, stock market could crash and that doesn't necessarily have an effect on the value of an asset. And so I sort of thought if Tesla is going to do what they say they're going to do, owning one of the first 100 cars or 1,000 cars they ever made has got to be a good investment, right? I mean, if you guys think about where, the 100th BMW or the 100th Porsche is nowadays, that's a collector car that's probably worth a 7-figure. So my thought process was, I can get a Roadster, and it's either going to be a good investment, or I just have a dope sports car, right? Kind of a win-win scenario. And around that time, Roadster production had ended in late 2011, and so there were no new ones left. But there were a fair number of used ones available, usually for about half the cost of what they were new. And a lot of times, people had traded in a Roadster to get a Model S. Because a lot of these early Tesla buyers, these early EV evangelists, They weren't buying Roadsters because they necessarily really wanted a carbon fiber lightweight two-door sports car. They didn't want an electric Lotus. They wanted an electric car. And, up until the Leaf came out in 2010, the Roadster was the only electric car you could. It was literally, it was the only electric car that could actually function as a car, right? Like there were some neighborhood EVs that really were glorified golf carts at the time. But so a lot of people were trading in Roadsters and to get a Model S because they were like, I want an actual car. I don't want a two-door tiny sports car with no features. And they only got one because they wanted an electric car at the time. And so, yeah, I found Roadster number 72 for sale in my area, negotiated a few $1,000s off what they were asking. And it's probably worth triple what I paid for it at the time. So, yeah, it is a little piece of what I think is automotive history. Because, obviously we're all here because we very much believe that the electric car is the future of, at least personal transportation. There's a whole other debate around public transportation and how that's probably better than personal car ownership. And I largely think that's true. But in North America, there's a lot of places where you really don't have that option. The United States as a society would kind of have to own it. So, yeah, I'm very much belief that like there is room for other powertrains, like there is room for hybrids, there is room for plug-in hybrids. Hydrogen I think could make sense for some non-consumer applications, like maybe Class 8 trucking, certainly some marine and aerospace applications, maybe even some trains as well. But like for personal vehicles, I kind of think like EVs are without a doubt the most efficient, kind of best engineered vehicular options out there. If you're towing a big trailer, like if you're towing a gooseneck trailer, you got to tow 30,000 pounds long distance. I will publicly say that a diesel truck is probably the better option, but like less than 0.1% of the U.S. population actually needs that on a consistent basis. So, yeah, like I think EVs are definitely awesome, and I've driven a lot of them, and I think that there are some bad ones out there, but in 2025, the number of really great ones is exceedingly large. And it's cool to see that because even 10, 12 years ago, that was not the case.
100%. Yeah, especially right now, if you think of like really good EVs for under $40,000 right now, I can just give you a whole list right now. So many of them, especially like with incentives, like you got the Model 3 Highland, you got the Hyundai Ioniq 5, which you can get for under 40,000 with incentives. Kia EV6 with incentives can also be under 40,000. There's just so many vehicles now. Yeah. But I think you brought up a really interesting point on the whole public transportation debate, because this is one that I think is really interesting, because sometimes there's people who comment on my posts who like just hate the idea of personal vehicle ownership. But the thing is, in the United States, I think having a public transportation future is just not anything feasible in the United States, just with how far spread apart things are, especially like here in the Southeast, where it's like, going to the grocery store is like a 10-mile drive. So I just figured we could maybe start on that note a little bit. And then David, do you have any overarching thoughts on the public transportation area?
Yeah, I agree for the most part, Wade, of exactly what you're saying. I think we've talked about that on the show here. And there's a matter of like ideal, which I think everyone could agree. If you do the math, public transit overall is better for everybody. It's more economic on a per ride basis, right? It's
lower emissions.
It's lower emissions. You just have to invest in the infrastructure. And the fact is, we don't have that type of infrastructure here. We've got roads. Eisenhower invested in the roads, and that's what we have. And let's make the most of it, because I actually personally, I don't know if you have any good experiences or stories about road trips and EVs, but I love how America's like a bit of like a road trip culture. I've done a lot of great road trips across the country, and having that individual freedom to kind of go from city to city, wherever you want to next in your own personal vehicle is I think something that's uniquely American in a good way. And to do that in the EV is even better. I found personally, and I think it's only getting better with chargers.
Yeah. So I try to never paint with too broad of strokes, because, like the United States is a big place. Some would argue it's 50 different countries, all matched up together. What works in the Southeast is not what works in New York City, is not what works in California, is not what works in Texas, right? So, I generally speaking am actually a pretty big fan of public transportation, but I will agree that in the United States, for the most part, it's not great, right? I think that some of the older, bigger cities on the East Coast that were really kind of like built and planned before the invention of the automobile naturally have public transportation, because of course they do, because that's, you were building a city in the 1800s, you needed a way for people to get around, right? And like cars were not invented yet, so they weren't even in the lexicon of how you build a city. In California, that's less true, right? Like in California, there's a lot of really car-centric urban design here. I live in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I don't live in the city itself. I live just south of San Francisco, kind of near the airport. And I am near a couple of different train systems. And when I need to go into San Francisco, if I can take the train, it's vastly preferable for me, because parking in San Francisco is a big pain in the butt. And also, there are some scenarios where I'm either kind of choosing to risk try and parking on the street, which is cheap, but there is the possibility that someone just hit and runs your car, or someone breaks in, even if you've got nothing to steal in there. Like there's plenty of scenarios where people break into Teslas because they assume that every single person in San Francisco has a bag with a laptop and $2,000 cash and several $1 million worth of Bitcoin on a server in it, which is of course not true. But you're either going to, risk getting your car broken into, or you're going to pay $20 an hour to park in a garage. And if I can pay $5 for a train ticket and I don't have to worry about parking, and, if I'm going to go out to dinner and get a drink, that I don't have to worry about driving myself home after that as well, like that's a vastly better experience for me than driving. But there are plenty of scenarios where, if I'm going to a certain part of the city that the trains don't go to, it's not an option. If I'm going to go to the East Bay, right? Train takes 3 times longer than it does in a car. So I got to really be committed to wanting to take the train in that scenario. I think agree, David, that from a cost per ride and a emissions per ride, public transportation is better. But, it's going to be a very cold day in hell when LA is a public transit mecca, right? And I'm picking a very car-centric example, but
I mean, it'd be interesting because you worked at Tesla, this new robo-taxi, and the robo-bus concept, right? Because in theory, if that Elon's been right on a lot, I think it's a little bit out there, but in theory, right? If transportation goes that way, you do need less parking lots. People just get picked up by an autonomous vehicle, and you got to go.
So just to give you a little bit of additional in my background, Andrew, you alluded to this as well. I've worked at a lot of different companies in the EV space, and we can go into more of those details. But I also briefly worked in the autonomous vehicle industry. I spent a couple of years working for a company that was building LiDAR specifically for self-driving car applications. And, I think Tesla is great about a lot of things, but I'm also not one of these people that, thinks that everything they do is perfect and right and good. And on the self-driving front, I kind of do think that there have been a lot of claims they've made and they have not been able to back them up. I sort of feel like, FSD's coming next year with the touch of a button. We've heard that every year since 2016, right? And so at this point, I'm just like, it's clearly not. But also, to really, really make a proper self-driving, that can operate in 99.999999, that's 6 nines, after that. They can operate in that number of use cases. That's just a monumental effort. And, we've seen Tesla do reasonably well with some of that, like highway assisted driving. Autopilot's fantastic. I don't currently own a vehicle with autopilot, but I had a 2018 Model 3 for a long time until last year. And I didn't get rid of it intentionally. It got totaled. I loved that car, but
Oh, that was one with free supercharging, right?
yeah,
That's tragic.
these things happen, right? Nobody's injured, and that's what counts. Um, but so like to really build a self-driving car, I honestly think we're well more than a decade out from that, like maybe more than 2 decades. Obviously, GM has basically folded Cruise, which I think is a corporate mistake, but they've invested so much money in that. And like also, like I don't ever intend to be critical of GM, but they do shoot themselves in the foot quite a lot. Super Cruise really is excellent, like for what it is, right? And like I know that the focus there is on highways, not city driving, but that's an easier use case to do self-driving in. So I guess, David, broadly speaking, when it comes to things like the robo-taxis and the robobus, I'm not holding my breath. I'm really not. And even then, per our earlier point about public transportation versus cell-phone vehicles, like that's really useful if you live in a dense city. If you live in Montana, you probably don't even want that. Like, even if technically, if the technology really was sound enough and if the regulatory environment supported it, I just don't know that there's very many people that are like, yeah, I would love to never drive again. I know people who feel that way, but I do think that, like there are parts of the country that people don't feel that way. I kind of think that the one scenario where self-driving could really make sense is actually Singapore, because it is a very dense, small city state. It's leaning authoritarian. And so they could literally, the government of Singapore could literally just say from 2027 onward, we're banning all human-driven cars, right? Like everything on the road has to be autonomous. And that's just how people will get around. I mean, it's not the only way they'll get around. Singapore has excellent public transportation. And so cars are not even necessarily the best way to get around already as it is. Part of the reason that cars are so expensive in Singapore is that they're more kind of like luxury status items than they are convenient transportation. But I do think like Singapore is a good example of where if you really wanted to test this and just make everything autonomous, self-driving cars could really work well in Singapore. What works well in Singapore is replicable in almost any American city.
Yeah, interesting. I will say on the Tesla FSD front, I was able. My dad has a Model Y with the hardware 4, and so they got the free trial of FSD, and I just tried it out like a week ago, and it was pretty impressive. Now, like, would I trust it? I think it's in an interesting stage right now because I think it's more of a cool novelty, but it's like it was able to drive from literally point A to point B hands-free. It even like slowed down for the speed bumps, which I think is really impressive. But it's interesting to see that system compared to like GM Super Cruise, like Nissan Pro Pilot, because a lot of those they will do highway driving, which FSD does. But I think it's really getting to a point where it's pretty cool, where you can see the car like going through intersections, noticing stoplights, letting pedestrians go, and it's pretty cool. Now, would I trust it enough that if I was like a passenger in it? I don't know, but it's definitely like from where it is now, I would say it's like light years better, or not light years, but significantly better than where it was at this point last year.
Sure. I mean, I totally believe you on that, Andrew. And, I mean, I remember when Autopilot came out, right? Like I was working for Tesla when Autopilot came out.
Highway Auto. That was with, what was that company? Mobileye?
Mobileye. You got it. Yeah. Like they basically said, they're like, only use this on the highway. Don't even use this on surface streets. And I, largely agree with that as well. Like I think that, Andrew, you're clearly a first adopter. I don't know that I would trust any of the autonomous driving systems in non-highway scenarios, right?
Yeah.
I absolutely agree with you that like FSD has gotten better. If it hadn't gotten better, that would be a massive failure on Tesla's part. But also, again, like I worked for a company that builds LiDAR, and I'm of the opinion that like the best autonomous system is one that has as much redundancy built into it as possible. And different sensors have different strengths and weaknesses. Radar is amazing in fog because it can see right through it. It's there to detect solid objects. It can see through fog. LiDAR and cameras get tripped up by fog like crazy, right? LiDAR does amazing at night. It doesn't matter for a laser if it's pitch black outside, right? Like it can see through all of that. And so, I do think that like the best autonomous systems are going to use all of those different technologies. And I will also say that sensor fusion is one of the most difficult challenges out there to solve for, right? Like that, like anyone who makes even remotely successful sensor fusion, like good job. That's really, really, really hard. But so like when Tesla, Elon has been against LiDAR for a long time. And I kind of understood that when it was $10,000 a unit, right? I really did. But like LiDAR has become commoditized a lot. It has come down in price a lot while its performance has improved. And Elon has continued to just, say it's terrible all the time. And I really struggle to technically find that true. I sort of just think that's an ego thing for Elon about like, he said it in the past and he can't ever admit that he's wrong. So, he's just always going to say bad things about LiDAR. And Tesla has even taken radar off cars before as well.
Yeah.
Like,
and the parking sensors. That was a big one.
Yeah. And like,
the ultrasonics.
and like those things are not expensive, right?
Yeah.
Like I know Tesla is trying to improve their margins all the time. And that's a good thing for a for-profit company, obviously. Like just
why there, right? Why there?
Same thing with the stocks, right? Like, are you really saving that much money by not having turn signals? Like I just sort of think that like sometimes it's tech for tech's sake, as opposed to like actually genuinely offering a better solution for customers. And so like, I find myself far more attracted to older Teslas than to newer ones because they have turn signals on them, a stock, like every other car I've ever owned in the 20 years that I've been driving. I find that older Teslas are more attractive because like I thought AP1 worked excellent and it has radar as well. So like, I'm less concerned about it making false positives because it can detect solid objects within my mind a greater degree of accuracy than Tesla's cameras. Or camera-only systems, right? I don't think Tesla's cameras are bad by any stretch. But anyone who tells me their camera-only system is better than a camera and radar system, I'm just like, no.
No. I mean, you got weather, right? You have rain, you've got snow. It's scary. Yeah.
And David, I'm actually glad you mentioned snow because, like, if you live in California like I do, or you live in Arizona, you have nice weather most of the year, right? Like, it's a relatively easy scenario. A lot of folks who live in Detroit are like, yeah, like, if your systems don't work here in the middle of winter where the roads are partially frozen, you can barely see the lines on it, and there's potholes everywhere. If your system can't handle that, it's useless to us. I don't live in Detroit, obviously, but I do sympathize with that point a lot. Different places have different requirements. And, a system that works really well in LA traffic doesn't necessarily work elsewhere as well. And I'm interested in the systems that work elsewhere too.
That's where I'm optimistic that we've got so many more OEMs producing electric vehicles and taking different approaches.
Totally.
And maybe challenging some of the philosophies of Tesla of certain minimalism. I'm really excited about Scout, for instance. I think that's going to be a really interesting vehicle. I think a lot of people love that. Hyundai's got a great one, right?
The Hyundai Kia group does not miss on electric cars. I have been so impressed with what they have made to the point that like I would rather buy an Ioniq 5 with my own money than a Model Y. I have been so impressed by what the Hyundai Kia group has put out. I obviously love my Rivian. Their autonomous driving system is, of course, not as good as Tesla's, but for how I use it, which is pretty much highway only, it's good enough for me. I will absolutely say that like it's not as good as Tesla's, and I expect that. Rivian's a much newer company, and they've had way less time to build and test and refine this than Tesla has. But like the Rivian system is good enough, in my opinion. I haven't logged enough miles on GM Super Cruise to, I think, really have a strong enough opinion. But I will say that, like, I do think that's one of the things GM has done very right as well. I'm super excited to try the now level 3 autonomous system that Mercedes is offering in their new S-Class and EQS. But I'm also not planning on buying one of those anytime soon, so whatever. But
Well, maybe in 2 years when they're worth like 30% of their original price.
I was saying,
The EQSs have depreciated so much. You can get them now for like 35,000 used, which is insane.
Crazy.
Like you can even get CPOs for like under 40.
Well, we need to talk about our Turo fleet, Andrew.
Yes. So I want to go into your Turo fleet because I think first off, I recently did a review of a BMW i4, which was rented on Turo. Turo kindly lent one to me for a week. And really cool program. I love Turo. I think it's a really great way to get behind the wheel of a bunch of different vehicles. And you, Wade, because now you mentioned the Model 3 has been totaled. So do you have 2 cars in your fleet now? Is it the original Model S?
Functionally, I have one at this point. Like I still have an older Model S, but that's largely just a personal car for my wife and I at this point. But yes, I have been a Turo host since 2016. I would say during that time period, my clients have probably logged over 200,000 miles on my cars. So yeah, I definitely have some personal experience when it comes to fleet operations for EVs. And like, yes, the powertrains. If you can get a car with free unlimited supercharging, it's a major competitive advantage as well. But I don't think I would, as a host, offer a non-electric vehicle on Turo. Also, because I'm an EV evangelist, right? Like and that's not to say that I'm not enthused by some gas-powered vehicles. Like I do have an older car with a 6-speed manual transmission that I will always love, but that's a weekend fun toy, right? Like that's, David, to sort of like steer it back towards something that you'd mentioned earlier, like gas cars are cool for road trips, for convenience reasons. But I drive down to Southern California, which is a 400 to 500 mile drive, one direction, typically several times a year. I can do it faster in the gas car, but I can do it more cheaply in the EVs typically. And also I have logged thousands of miles on electric road trips, and it's slow. I'm not going to cut it any other way. It is not as fast as gas cars, but for me personally, that's better. Chris Harris has sort of said the same thing. You shouldn't measure a car's electric range. You should measure it in your personal bladder range, right? Like I can go about 2, maybe 2.5 hours until I really have to be, right? And until my legs are starting to get sore and I want to get up and stretch. And that's true even in the most comfortable seats in the auto industry. I don't like to sit for more than 2 hours continuously. And I know there's a ton of people out there who would be like, I can drive for 10 hours straight. And it's like, well, good for you. I don't want to do that, right? And so I'm hugely impressed by the range and efficiency of Lucid's vehicles. Andrew, I know you have a lot of experience with those, but that's overkill for someone like me. I can't go that long of just sitting and driving. I need and want to stop sooner than that. And so the cadence of, drive 2.5 hours and then stop because you need to stretch your legs and pee anyways while your car charges for 10 to 20 minutes, that works great for me. I'm very, very used to that. And so when it comes to EV road tripping, I'm very sold on that. That's a very easy thing for me to say yes to. I'm also very privileged because I live in California where we have the best EV charging infrastructure in the country at the moment. I do think that it is getting better elsewhere as well. But I also do think that so many people, when they start to think about buying an EV, they overemphasize on road trips. Oh, how do I do this? How many road trips a year do you take? How many trips of 100 or more miles do you do in a year? Because for most people, it's a single digit number. You can probably count on one, right?
And sometimes you can even do those on level 2 alone. Like if you're driving 250 miles in one direction, you just stop at a hotel, which you're going to be doing anyways, just level 2 charge overnight. Don't even have to stop at a DC fast charger.
Even then, if, let's say you take 2 big road trips a year and the total time on said road trips is 10 days, a week and a half, right? You can still rent a car, you can rent a you can rent an Escalade if you want, or, like you can rent some giant gas guzzling SUV that fits, your family and 7,000 other things that you may or may not need on said trip. If an EV works for you for 355 days out of the year, for the love of God, buy it. Like you'll be happier most of the time. You'll save a lot of money on fuel in almost every scenario. If you, if you're driving a Prius in a state that has $2.20 a gallon gasoline, maybe an EV won't be cheaper for you to run. But the number of places where that's true and that calculus is not tilted in favor of EVs is getting smaller. And we have a huge amount of fossil fuel subsidies in the United States. So, if those get removed, I don't think they will, but if those get removed, going EV becomes the cheaper option pretty much everywhere overnight. And that's why in places like Europe, where they don't have fossil fuel subsidies, it's unquestionably cheaper to run an EV than it is.
Yeah. And I think another cool thing about EVs, and this is just kind of a side note, but a lot of people argue, oh, where's the independence in that? You have to rely on all these charging stations, et cetera, et cetera. But the thing is, I think the most free idea would be to have home solar, maybe a Tesla Powerwall in your house or a Ford F-150 Lightning or something like that. And basically you could make all your energy at home, and then you can charge your electric vehicle on there, and you'll be totally off the grid. You won't have to rely on anything, because right now it's with the internal combustion engines, you have to rely on the whole oil supply chain just to get fuel for your car. And obviously that's not going to vanish overnight, but you still have to rely on tons and tons and tons of people just to get the fuel that you need for your car to drive.
Absolutely. And, I couldn't agree more, Andrew. And I feel lucky that I, almost have what you described, directly above me is an 8.5 kilowatt solar array. I do have a Powerwall here at home, and I've got a pair of EV chargers, right? During the summertime, I'm probably 60 to 70% off grid. And during the winter, it's probably more like 30 to 40% off grid. But yeah, I mean, especially with the net energy metering program that I'm on, my electrical costs are negligible. And
what's the electricity like in your area? Because I know in the Bay, it's I read around 40 cents a kilowatt hour. What's the going rate?
I'm on a time of use rate. And so, energy between midnight and 3 a.m. is substantially cheaper. Energy between midnight and 3 p.m., so a 15-hour period, is substantially cheaper than it is during peak hours. But even unsophisticated EVs nowadays, you can set a basic delay where you can plug into a dumb charger and just tell it, don't start charging until midnight. So, yes, I do live in an area with expensive electricity. I also live in an area with very expensive gasoline as well. You could say I live just in an expensive area, period. But I don't really notice how much my electric bill is. Sometimes in the summer, it's negative, right? So net, I am paying not very much money for fuel. If I think about if I had gas versions of the electric cars that I have, right? I have, the Roadster, I don't really drive very much, so I'm not really going to count it. But I have a Model S and a Rivian R1S. And if I think about comparable gas versions about that, right? If I had a BMW 5 Series and a Range Rover, right? Those are both cars that maybe 20 mpg. In the Range Rover, it's probably more like 15, right? I currently don't drive a ton. I don't have to, thankfully, but I'd be spending hundreds of dollars a month on gasoline. And I would be surprised if my home charging for two cars, both of which are not exactly small, light, efficient vehicles, it's got to be under $100.
I think the other thing that people forget about, aside from just the fuel cost comparison, is the maintenance costs, like oil changes. I have to say, when I was younger, I was the person who was oh, I can do my own oil changes because I'm not going to pay the ridiculous amount that Jiffy Lube was that I thought at the time because I was trying to save money. But, it's kind of a pain and it adds up over time. And then you got other so many fluids and so many transfer cases or transmission fluid. And and all these other things that you have to think about in the total cost of ownership of a traditional gas vehicle versus an electric vehicle. I mean, it's tires and windshield wiper fluid pretty much, right?
Absolutely. And also, in California, we've got smog checks. They're not annual, but they're every 2 years. And, like if you've got an older car that is starting to have an exhaust leak and you don't pass smog, you can't re-register it, right? Like, you can have a car impounded for that. And that will never, ever happen in my now 12-year-old Model S, right? Like my Model S is one of the first 500 ever made. I have 186,000 miles on it, and it is going to get better over time, not worse. Literally, California already has a pretty clean grid, but broadly speaking, in the entire United States and globally, as we shift away from coal and away from natural gas and oil power production, as the grid itself gets cleaner, every electric car that gets charged by it gets cleaner over time as well. No gas engine is ever going to get better over time, right? Like it's not how physics works. And so that's another, like environmental selling point of electric cars. And I know there's plenty of people out here who could not give a toss about that. But like as someone who has spent a lot of time, diving deep on the energy systems that are upstream of EV charging and how the grid at large works, it's another advantage of EVs is that like as the grid improves, so do EVs. And, any gas car, the cleanest, the most powerful, the best it's going to be is the day you buy it. And it only is downhill from that. Might be a very slow downhill stretch, but like no gas engine will get more efficient over time. It's just not.
Yeah, because that's another thing. Because electric cars have the ability to be zero emissions depending on where you get your fuel from. But with gas cars, you got to use gasoline.
I mean,
even
guess,
some of the e-fuel.
I guess if you have like a diesel and you're doing some biodiesel, maybe, right? And I know Porsche has talked a lot about synthetic fuels as well.
Yeah, and some of those synthetic fuels, basically they capture carbon from the atmosphere to make the fuel themselves. So in end, it's just basically like a non-zero sum game. You're just taking out carbon in the atmosphere, making the fuel, and then putting it back out into the atmosphere.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are a wide variety of solutions out there, and I am obviously very pro battery electric vehicle, but I do think there is a place for others. Some of it's going to be more niche. But from a wheel to well efficiency perspective, EVs have already proven themselves out to be the best option, right? So, I would also say that just like broadly speaking, for people who are considering an electric car, like the main reason to buy them is that they're fun to drive and that they're safe and they're well equipped and, like they have lots of performance and they will probably save you money as well. Like environmental concerns are important to me, but like big picture stuff, like they'll run for longer at lower cost and they're lower cost of fuel and they'll last, right? Like I'm sure there's going to be some people who will challenge me on battery replacement and timing. And I can talk about that as well, because I have replaced the battery pack in my Model S, but also, net, like replacing the battery in an older EV in some cases can make sense. Replacing the engine in a 250,000 mile car, diminishing returns.
You also mentioned the fun to drive factor too. And I think the really beautiful thing about electric cars is performance and efficiency are not mutually exclusive. You can get both. You can get EVs that are incredibly fast and also like Lucid Air, perfect example. The base model makes 430 horsepower, but it also gets 5 miles per kilowatt hour. And there's no gas car you can buy, especially in the same form factor of like a sedan, that is non-hybrid. So non-hybrid gas car that is very fuel efficient and also very fast. There is no gas car. I mean, maybe like some of the Mercedes with like the 4 cylinders, but it's like, what, you're getting 25 miles per gallon if you drive nicely.
Yeah. Well, and you're totally right, Andrew. And also like what you're describing is literally the genesis of Tesla, right? Like when you go ask Martin Eberhard, who by the way was the founder of Tesla, Elon was not, if you ask Martin Eberhard, like how it happened and why Tesla started in 2004, they had sort of looked around, and in Palo Alto, they had sort of noticed that like a typical 2-car garage there was like a Prius and a Porsche. And like, that wasn't always the case, but like, there were plenty of people there who had a hybrid for fuel economy reasons. And like, just, it's a smart purchase to make. Prius doesn't have a great driving experience, but like, that's not its focus. The point is efficiency and low cost. And, to that extent, Priuses are excellent. And then the Porsche was the fun car, but like you said, Andrew, the performance came at a cost, and electric cars can combine that. And so, yes, like I love that, the average EV is faster than, most older sports cars, even up to 10 years ago, while getting double the efficiency of a Prius. It's a cheat code, and it's awesome.
Oh, an interesting thing that you brought up, though, is that there's no compromise when it comes to EVs. You can get great performance and great practicality. But it's interesting that I think the sports car industry hasn't fully adopted EVs yet. I feel like they're slow and they're dragging their feet a bit when it comes to producing really awesome performance EV vehicles. I mean, I can only name a handful off the top of my head. Like Rimac is the top that I can think of. And then Porsche is saying they're doing EVs, but I think honestly, the EVs that they're putting out aren't that great for what you're paying for that price. You can get like a bunch of other better EVs actually that aren't in the sports performance category. And I really can't think of much else. Like there's a bunch of hybrids, but it's interesting that it's lagging.
I'm really excited about the 718 Boxster and Cayman. They have basically publicly said that they're in development hell for this, but also, like, that's a hard use case, right? I mean, like, a big part of a good sports car is keeping weight down, and that's hard to do in an EV, right? Like, it's just hard to do. Like the Rimac you mentioned, awesome, amazing piece of kit, right? Like quad motor vehicle with 2,000 horsepower will out accelerate anything short of an aircraft, right? Like, the Rimac is incredibly impressive, but it's also a big, heavy car. Like I've been up close in person with one at a charging station before, and it is not small. Like it is a wide, long vehicle, kind of in the same way that Formula One cars now are just bigger than they were in the past. Like, to really take something like a Boxster, a 3,000-ish pound lightweight, good handling sports car, that's really hard to do given current battery chemistry and the range calculation, right? I mean, like, like the Roadster that I have is a 2,900 pound car that does not make that much power. I think that was a function of motor tech that was available in 2007. But, I mean, like part of the reason the Roadster is so light is that it's got a, aluminum chassis and an all carbon fiber body. And the battery in it is relatively small. It's a 50 something kilowatt hour pack. I want to say it was a 53 kilowatt hour pack. And even then, that weighed 1,000 pounds. If they remade that today, I'm sure they could cut weight off of that. But that's hard to do. And as you guys know, that's not where the mass market is, right? Like, when we talk about EVs, as much as I'm a sports car enthusiast, and I am excited about the Boxster EV, like the new Chevy Bolt is a more impactful vehicle that's more important. The $35,000 Equinox, the new Nissan Leaf, like, those are more important cars in the grand scheme of things. So, David, I'm definitely excited to see what, electric sports cars we get in the future. Ferrari's supposed to release their first EV this year, but, that's niche stuff. And enthusiast Wade is interested in that. Mass market EV Wade is like,
yeah, for sure. But I think it would be like, just theoretically, it would be really cool if they could if there was a remake of the Tesla Roadster today with like all modern battery technology, because I'm sure the new battery today would weigh much less than the battery that was in the original Roadster. And just to get another lightweight sports car, obviously it would be a very niche car, but it's just something really cool to think about. Because I mean, even the Roadster that I drove of yours was really impressive for today. And even with 248 horsepower, which doesn't sound like a lot, is a lot in the Tesla Roadster.
Yeah, in a 2,900 pound car, you can get away with having a lot less power. Yeah, I mean, I definitely think you could make something like that was uh, faster and better. It's just a question of, how much does it cost to make something like that? But also, at the end of the day, really, like, you want a lightweight EV. The biggest thing is you need a smaller battery pack. And, you know, I don't know that Porsche is willing to put out a Boxster EV if it only has 150 miles of range. I'd buy that. But like, would the rest of America? Probably not. Would Germany? I don't know. Probably not. But so, like, that's the efficiency calculation is always going to be, less battery, less weight, greater efficiency. And Lucid and Hyundai are like the two companies in my mind that are like really like in the same competitive bracket as Tesla for that motor and system efficiency, which is really important. But like, we as engineering people are interested in that. The average consumer is not even on their top 10.
They probably don't even look at weight whenever they're looking at or when they're like Googling a car. They're just like, okay, what is this? What does it offer? And that's the kind of unfortunate thing because like the new Tesla Model 3, I was just kind of tracking the weights of all the Tesla Model 3s throughout the production or throughout its production existence. And the weights have come down a lot in the long range models, which I think is really cool. But one of the Model 3s that I really liked was just the 2019 Standard Range Plus, because that weighed about 3,600 pounds because it had around a 50 kilowatt hour battery pack, which was, I think, really nice. And obviously people wanted more range, but it's like, it would be really nice to see some more lightweight EVs make it to the market, just for the performance factor. Now, again,
go to Europe.
No one really cares that much.
Yeah, no, I mean, Europe, I think, cares more about that because, apropos of our conversation about public transit, the average European uses their car to just get around a city, right? Like they're like, if I'm going to go to another city, I'm going to take the train. So I don't need a car with more than 250 kilometers of range, 150 miles, right? They're like, that's more than enough for urban driving. The average American is like, well, can I drive to Florida in it tomorrow? And it's like, well, how often do you actually do that? But that's why I think there's been this obsession with 300 miles of range or more in a car, because that's like approximately comparable to gas. And like, I'm not here to tell people what's right for them. Different people have different needs. And, for me personally, 200 is totally fine, right? I mean, I've had a BMW i3 before. I had one of the first ones that had 80 miles of range. I made it work as a commuter car. I put 43,000 miles on that car in 3 years. But, like my 150 mile range i3, I knew that was a commuter car, right? Like that was not an EV road trip. Mm-hmm. But as a commuter car, just for driving around the Bay Area, it's brilliant. It's great. Weighed 2,900 pounds. It's fun as heck to drive.
I think that is one of the coolest EVs ever made. And I was about to buy one this summer, but then I know I have my drive from where I live to college is pretty much about the range of the car. And just, I know if there's like something that happens, there's very few chargers in the way. I would have loved to make the i3 happen. But then again, this i3 that I found, it was like 2021. So it was a newer one, which was nice. But I think the few things were the tires, because tires are pretty expensive. And I do like my performance. So I know I'd go through tires pretty quickly. And then this one had like 0 features on it. So I had no adaptive cruise control, really nothing, which was a little unfortunate. But maybe one day in the future, when I have my EV collection, the i3 is going to be the first one I'd put in there.
They're cool. I like the i3s. Most people don't because I think they're ugly, but engineering wise, they're deeply impressive cars.
100%. And as we start to wrap up this conversation, I want to ask you one final question, Wade. And what are some of the EVs that you're really excited about that are going to come out in the future? Because I think there's already so many great ones right now out on the market. But are there any upcoming that you have your eyes set on, or maybe something to add to the Turo fleet?
Yeah. The Turo fleet's always an interesting one because what I want personally versus what will rent well are two different things. There's a few EVs that come to mind for me. I've already mentioned the 718 EV, the Porsche, just because I like sports cars. But like, I really do think that the vehicles that matter are going to be the mass market ones, the ones that can sell in really high volume. It's already out, but the Kia EV9 has been a deeply impressive vehicle because so many Americans want a 3-row, 6 or 7 passenger vehicle that's not ridiculously priced. And that's not to say that I think the EV9 is cheap, but it's the cheapest in its category, and it's also very, very good. Hyundai is going to make a similar version of it, so the Hyundai Ioniq 9. I hope those things outsell the Telluride and the Palisade, right? Like those are important cars for the American market. You know, I'd like to see Ford or GM come out with a smaller EV pickup truck as well, like a Ranger EV or Chevy Colorado EV, GMC Canyon EV. Like that would be sweet, just because those are the segments that really aren't touched there as well. The $35,000 Equinox, I hope that Chevy dealers just have stuck to the gills with those. And I hope the Bolt comes back, right? Just because like I say all of this because these are vehicles that will sell in high volume. And if we really want EV sales to take off, they have to be high volume cars in the first place, but they also, you know, there needs to be a big used supply of them. There needs to be a big parts supply for them. You know, I mean, like part of the reason the Model 3 is so successful right now is that almost anywhere you can get parts for it. You have people who know how to work, right? Like it's, you know, it just exists in massive quantities. And that's what really is like gonna help the tipping point, you know, where more and more people are getting into an EV. Most people buy used cars. Most people don't buy new cars. And so like, you know, as much as I'm really excited about a bunch of $100,000 plus super high performance EVs coming out, like in my mind, those don't really move the needle on adoption. You know, like for my job at Walmart of, you know, building out charging stations at stores there, you know, I think about the sort of people who regularly shop at Walmart and, you know, are trying to be smart about their money. And like, you know, for someone who's going to use a station like that with frequency, a Honda Prologue is a way cooler car than the new Mercedes AMG EQS, right? Like, you know, I'm obviously enthused by 700 horsepower electric sedans with lots of features that can go 0 to 60 in very illegal speeds. Yeah, like honestly, you know, the new vehicles like the Chevy Bolt or what.
I'd say I have to agree with you completely on that.
Yeah, I mean, and like I know Inside EVs has put out articles sort of saying the same thing. So that's what I'm excited about. You know, like I will always be enthusiastic about, you know, fun, cool stuff. I'd love to see the Polestar 5 or 6, like the, you know, that sports car looking vehicle.
I think it's a 6. Yeah.
I mean, like, you know, that's got styling elements of a Porsche 911 and a Bentley Continental GT. That's awesome. It's going to be a $250,000 car that exists in very small volumes, but it's very cool.
All right. Well, thank you very much for coming on, Wade.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me, guys. This was fun.
Thanks.